Hubble Space Telescope team. A great mission. Good luck, Godspeed. See you back here in about 11 minutes. Enjoy the ride, pal.
The other night, my wife and I were watching a movie when the power in our house suddenly went out. The story we had both been so caught up in suddenly ended without an ending. We eventually went to bed without finishing it, but I found myself lying there thinking about the characters and about their unresolved story. Every English student learns that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Stories work because they come to an ending, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, but always an end. What do you do with a story that doesn't seem to have an ending? What do you do when the story suddenly goes silent? It struck me that most of our lives feel like that movie. We're stuck somewhere in the middle, not quite sure how or if there will be any kind of satisfying ending. As we come to the end of Genesis, it feels like so much of the biblical story is left undone. What about this sin problem that humanity continued to face? And what about the garden that had been lost? As we come to the final pages of Genesis and open to the next book, Exodus, those ambiguities only seem to get worse. Joseph's family stayed in Egypt and grew into a nation, but a nation which was enslaved by the Egyptians. God had built a people as he had promised, but his people weren't free to worship or to live by his guidance. The Israelites called out to God, suffering under the rule of their masters. But for hundreds of years, God seemed to be silent. It's as if the whole story came to a halt. Where were the great miracles? Where were the great men and women of faith leading God's people? Where was God's voice? They listened, and they only heard silence. How many of them must have laid in their beds, wondering about the ending of their own story? What was God doing? Had he abandoned them? Could he not hear them? Was this the end of their story? The book of Exodus introduces us to the character of Moses, and immediately we find ourselves hoping that he will be the one to put an end to Israel's suffering. But Moses' efforts quickly failed, and he found himself fleeing into the wilderness. Moses took up a life of shepherding, all of Israel's hopes fading to the background. It was in this wilderness, in this barren time of God's silence, so far from the cry of his people, that Moses came across a burning bush, and from it heard the voice of God. God spoke. I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses hadn't gone looking for God, but one day stumbled upon him. At least that's how it must have seemed to Moses. In reality, God had put himself right in Moses' path. God was with Moses, and he still heard the cry of his people in Egypt. I think it's interesting that God refers to Israel as my people. Israel had not been forgotten. God's silence did not mean his absence. God had not only heard their prayers, he was with them. They were his. They belonged. When we find ourselves confused and disoriented by our own story, when God is silent and we struggle to understand where it is all going, we're tempted to believe that his silence means we've been abandoned. But Israel's God was with them, with Moses in the wilderness and with them in their suffering. His silence was not his absence. They are his people, and his silence only deepened his resolve to act, to bear their suffering, and to lead them on to a better land. Our God is not somewhere out there, waiting for our prayers to accumulate into a cry loud enough to respond. He is with us. He is close. He would show it to Israel in the power of his deliverance, and on throughout Scripture in the humility of taking on flesh. We too are his people, even as we too wait. Listen.